I don't know if you've ever had a scary time with water. I've had some really frightening times with water before. When I was a child, there were a couple of coaches in Oak Cliff, one of them at the junior high school I went to, and one of them at the senior high school. They were uncle and nephew. And during the summertime, when they were not being coaches and teaching physical education, they taught swimming lessons. And they guaranteed to teach your child how to swim in just a week. It was guaranteed. And if he didn't learn in a week, give him the second week for free. His name was Mr. Boyette. He was an old boxer. He looked like a giant to me. His shoulders were about this wide. He towered above us all in the swimming pool. I was terrified of him, scared to death. We used a swimming pool at an apartment complex, and it was pretty chlorinated water. I knew it was very sanitary, but it just reeked of chlorine. And for many years after the 3 weeks of lessons I had with Mr. Boyette, and he finally just gave me a mercy passing because I was terrified. Every time I'd smell chlorine, I'd feel like I'd throw up. I was so afraid of the water. Well, after I survived cancer the first time, mom and dad said, we need to do a trip. We need to celebrate that you're going to live a long time and be healthy now. And so they decided to take me on a cruise. They said, would you like to take your girlfriend? It's like, yeah, I'd love to. Well, they're traditional people. So I roomed with my dad on the cruise, and she roomed with my mom on the cruise. I also had a diamond ring for her, and I was planning to propose now that I knew I was going to live. So I invited her on the cruise, and she said, yeah, I'd love to go. But she said, I'm a little bit iffy about all that water. Being out in the middle of the ocean where you can't see any land at all. And so she went to Tom Landry at Baylor Hospital, joined the fitness club there, and took swimming lessons. Before we went on that cruise, she was up to swimming 2 miles every morning. That's a lot of miles swimming. So she became an excellent swimmer. And we drove to Galveston. We parked the car. We got on the shuttle. We got to the boat. We unloaded all of our luggage. And as we were about to board, she's standing there. She's got tears in her eyes, and she's shaking a little bit. I said, what's the matter? She said, I had no idea it's so big. Because, a cruise liner is kind of like a skyscraper laying on its side. And she just felt like she was going to be consumed by that thing. And then it was going to be out in the middle of the ocean. And it was just a frightening thing. And shame on me. I had assured her, I've been on a bunch of cruises before that, love cruises. That's why my parents offered to take me on another cruise. I enjoy them a lot. And I said, hey, they've got these stabilizers. The ships are big. They won't be affected. The most I've ever seen when it comes to motion on a cruise liner was maybe my glass, the water at dinner. If the seas were getting choppy, I might see the water level just shift from side to side a little. Well, we had quite the storm going on. And during that storm, we were watching one of the shows, and the boat tipped so much that the dancing girls ran across the stage. Some of them fell on the floor and rolled across each other. And then they rolled back the other way. They stopped the show. They sent everybody to their room because it was not safe to be out and around. And I was just having a blast watching people trying to walk down the hall of the ship that was just moving so much. She didn't see the fun on that. She got motion sickness. It was a tough time. What we're looking at today is Jesus' disciples found themselves totally, completely in the dark on the Sea of Galilee in a headwind that was really rough. And we're going to learn some things from their experiences with Jesus. We continue our series on walking with Jesus. There's a pattern all of us will tend to fall into. Some of us on a regular basis. It still creeps up on me. What happens is we'll forget about the goodness of God. We just forget. We get wrapped up in life, and we just forget how good God is, how faithful he is, how he always takes care of us. He always keeps his promises. We forget. And once we forget how good God is, the next level we go to is fear, from forgetfulness to fear. And we become fearful. And when we become fearful, it tips our emotional seesaw. Our fear goes up, our clarity of thought goes down, and we start to fail. And after we fail for a little while, we finally fall. I'd like to propose to you 3 things today that will keep you from going through that cycle again and again and again. The first thing is remember and understand how God works, how good He is, how He never sleeps, He never slumbers. He's looked ahead for you, as Romans 8:28, 29, and 30 talks about. Before there was a universe, God foreknew you. And then He predestined you. And then He called you. And then He justified. And He's in the process of glorifying you. He's got a plan for you, and you're going to make it. You're going to satisfy His plan, His good plans for you. And it's just important to understand His ways are different from our ways, but He's always good. The second thing we need to realize is it's hard to recognize Jesus in new and different situations. It's hard to recognize Jesus in new and different, unfamiliar situations. And the third thing is once we've recognized Him and we remember how good He is, we just need to keep our focus on Him. We need to fixate ourselves on Jesus rather than the problems, the struggles, the challenges in life. So we go to Matthew chapter 14. There was a guy named Herod. Herod was a religious ruler, and he hated John the Baptist because John the Baptist was always going after his brother Philip for having an immoral relationship going on, said, you should stop that. You should end that. Well, Herod wanted to assassinate or execute John the Baptist, but the people thought he was a prophet, so he didn't want to start too much of a problem. And keep in mind, the Jewish people had been waiting for a Messiah to come for hundreds of years. And their expectations were going to be a military ruler, a political ruler, somebody that had set up a welfare state, get their promised land back to them. They'd have all they needed forevermore, and it'd be heaven on earth. Well, Jesus came with a little bit different kind of kingdom than that in mind. So John the Baptist is in the crosshairs of Herod. Herod wants him out of there. And Herod has a birthday party. I'm going to guess he was probably a little bit overserved because this young lady danced for them all. And he was so enthralled with her dance. He said, listen, that was so good. I will give you anything up to half of my kingdom that you'd like. What can I do for you? And somebody suggested to her, ask for the head of John the Baptist. So the king kept his word. Here, he wasn't a king, he was a ruler. He kept his word, and he had John the Baptist executed, cut off his head, brought the head on a platter to his birthday party. So John the Baptist died a frivolous death. This is a big deal for Jesus. Now, keep in mind, Jesus is our great high priest, and he was tempted in every way that we could possibly be tempted, yet he was without sin. That means he understands when you're having a tough time. He understands when you're disappointed. He understands when you're in grief. He understands what it's like to lose somebody like John the Baptist, who you'd grown up with. Your parents were very close. He's a cousin. He's the guy that was there at your baptism, and he baptized you. And if he will, he's the one that ordained him, started his ministry, was there and witnessed the Holy Spirit descend on him. So the disciples hear about John the Baptist. They go and tell Jesus. This is his response in verse 13. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the days are now over. Send the crowd away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves. But Jesus said, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. They said to him, we only have 5 loaves here and 2 fish. And he said, bring them here to me. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who were there were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now, I want you to understand what's going on. Jesus was absolutely grief-stricken. He just needed to take a break, but the crowds came after them. He was compassionate to them. He healed their sick. He even recognized something as they've been here all day and they're probably hungry. They need to eat something. It was the end of the day. It was about to get dark. All the places in the neighboring villages where they could get food would be closed. So Jesus said, okay, disciples, you're going to feed them. Now look at the authority Jesus had. There are 5,000 men plus the women and children. I'm going to guess at least 20,000 people there. That's a lot. Can you imagine one man, 20,000 people, and when he says, sit down on the grass, whew, they all sit. I mean, they had seen the miracles. They'd heard about him. They would do what he wanted to do. Even before he did this miracle to feed them, they already were under his authority. They would do what he said. And then he told his disciples, you are going to feed them. Can you imagine what that's like? Can you imagine if there were, just this whole neighborhood was filled with people. And I said, hey, you're going to feed them. And you go, we got 2 hamburgers and 5 baskets of French fries. Now go feed them. You'd wonder about that. But he took what he had and he started ripping it apart and handing it to him. And he kept tearing and handing it, tearing and handing it. Now there are 12 of them. There are roughly 20,000 people. Everybody's sitting down. They're seeing him from afar. They can tell. It's not going away. What is in his hand is not going away. And he keeps ripping it, giving it, ripping it, giving it, ripping it, giving it. And somehow these 12 disciples were probably running from group to group to group, tossing food at them, and they got all of them fed. Now, this is so important to understand. He had authority over them. He also had authority over his disciples. And the next thing that happens, immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. Has God ever disappointed you? Have you ever been in a good time of life, having a great time, and all of a sudden he makes you go do something else? That's where the disciples were. They were the rock stars. They were the superheroes. All these 20,000 people were so excited to see them participating, and they received the food from these guys. Well, when you look at the big picture of what's going on, Herod has really upset some people, and this is the perfect time for a military takeover. And his disciples were probably thinking, this is our chance. We've got 20,000 people here that would probably walk with us to Herod's home and take him out. And this is a good time for the Messiah to establish his kingdom. Jesus had something in mind. I want you to understand, Jesus always has something better for you. No matter where you are, no matter how good it is, he's got something better. These guys were probably thinking, this is the best we've ever seen. And we got hands-on experience with the miracle. And we get to feed this massive crowd of people. They were probably on a huge high, just thinking this is the coolest thing ever. And he says, get in the boat and go across the lake. They were probably disappointed, but they obeyed. And then it got worse. You ever had those times where you obey God and then it gets worse? It happens. This is where it's so important to remember how he works and understand his goodness. Even if you have obeyed him, you may still find yourself in difficult circumstances. And if you can just understand he is doing something for your good, and you can find Jesus in the middle of that situation, and you can keep your eyes on him, everything will be fine. This is what happened with the disciples. Verse 23, chapter 14 of Matthew. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time, the boat, there weren't other boats, it was the boat. The boat was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves. There's some important words in here. In chapter 20, in verse 22, it said, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat. Some of your translations will say he constrained the disciples to get into the boat. They probably didn't want to go. That's why he had to constrain them. They probably said, we don't want to leave. We're loving this. This is a huge opportunity. All these people will do anything you ask them to do. We should take advantage of this. We can promote your kingdom here. But he had to constrain them. He said, no, you're going to get the boat. You're going to leave. Jesus already knew what they were going into. Don't ever forget, God already knows everything all the time. He's seen the end. It may feel like he's led you into trouble, but it's because he's trying to lead you to something better. So he constrained them and he started praying. Who do you think he was praying for? Probably for them. They were his sheep. He was their shepherd. He's probably praying for them. And they were a long way from the land, beaten by the waves. That word for beaten means they were tortured. They were tormented by the waves, and the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night. Now, anybody who was a fisherman, anybody who spent a lot of time on a boat, understood the watches. The first watch was 6 to 9 when it was getting dark. Because when you were on the water, somebody needed to be awake all the time just to keep things safe. So first watch, 6 to 9. Second watch, 9 to midnight. Third watch, midnight to 3. Fourth watch, 3 to 6 in the morning. So it's late. These guys have had a long, hard day. It was probably an aerobic exercise just to feed 20,000 people who were sitting on the grass waiting for them to come and give them the food. They got it done. That's quite a massive task to do. And now they've been fighting for hours against the wind, and it keeps blowing them back. Some of the scholars did logistics and figured out where they were. It really was going to be an easy trip from the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee, kind of across the corner, just cut across where they were going. The scriptures, one of them, Mark said they were going to Bethesda. John said they were going to Capernaum. That's why we got these 4 different gospel accounts. And this is one of these times it's a good illustration. Sometimes people read the Bible and say, well, it contradicts himself. Were they going to Bethesda or were they going to Capernaum? Well, Bethesda was just a suburb of Capernaum. It's kind of like if I say, hey, I got some friends coming in. I'm going to take them to lunch in Dallas. And I take them to a restaurant in Oak Cliff. Well, one of them might say, yeah, he took us to a restaurant in Oak Cliff. Another would say he took us to a restaurant in Dallas. They were both accurate. They're both right. It was just different ways to describe the truth. So you see that here. And they get out there, they've done exactly what they were supposed to be doing, and it's not going well. And when the fourth watch of the night came to them, and when the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, it is a ghost. And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I, don't be afraid. This brings us to the second point I want to make today is after you've remembered and understood how God works, in that everything he does, he always has you in mind. He's always trying to move you toward something better. He's always got something better. No matter what happens, no matter what you lose, he always has something better. So important to keep that in mind. They just didn't recognize God in this situation. They were in an absolutely exhausting, dark, hopeless situation, and they didn't recognize Jesus. So he helped them. He spoke to them. They heard his voice. Now, we go on with this. You know how Peter always puts himself front center in everything. Verse 28, and Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand, took hold of him, saying to him, Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? We're back where we started. We forget how good God is. And when we forget how good he is, we get ourselves into fear. And when we get ourselves into fear, then we start to fail. And after we failed enough, we finally fall. The way to keep from doing that, we come to the third point here, is when Peter was looking at Jesus, he was walking on the water. When he was fixated on God, he was doing supernatural things. When he shifted his focus from Jesus to the winds, and we've all got winds in our life. We've got those things that just blow in and bring dust and stuff that gets in our eyes and knocks things over and makes life difficult. When we shift our focus from God to the winds of life, that's when we start to sink. And that's what happened. So when we remember how good God is and understand that his ways are different from ours, but he's always at work. He never sleeps. He never slumbers. He never takes his eye off of you. He knows your heart's desire. He's trying to move you toward it. Oftentimes it takes a long time. I've had so many long detours in my life. I remember one time I had a wonderful 7-year plan for God. Have y'all never had a 7-year plan for God? Well, I had this great thing. I got a summer job at Glorieta Baptist Encampment. I was a student at Baylor. I was working on a business degree, and I watched, it was a whole bunch of former pastors who were in leadership positions of pretty much a big corporation, the Southern Baptist Sunday School Board. And I realized they have great training in theology and ministry and things like that, but they just don't know anything about business. And I thought, this is God's calling for me. I need to get this bachelor's of business administration degree, go to seminary, get a master's, and then go to work for the Baptist Sunday School Board and straighten them out. I thought, God, see you then. Well, I hadn't learned yet about a daily quiet time. So it's like, great, I'm set. See you in 7 years. I'll get it done. I was a good soldier. I fully intended to do that. But that was a big, huge detour. And then when God was trying to move me out of local church ministry, which I could not imagine there would ever be a better job for me than serving a local church, I begged and pleaded for another 7 years. God, please, 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 please let me go back to work for a local church. That's the only place I can get paid to do what I love to do. And that's what I'm called to do. And I want to do it. And I need your help. And he nearly had to break all my knuckles to let me get rid of that. Now I have my own ministry. I do exactly what I want to, whenever I want to. I don't have to have any meetings at all unless I have scheduled them. It's wonderful. I'm making a lot more money than I did in the local church. I have so many things that I don't have to do anymore. I don't have to work evenings or weekends unless I just choose to. He had something so much better, but I couldn't imagine it. And I didn't remember how good he was. And I couldn't find Jesus in all of this. So I was miserable for about 7 years saying, please, 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 let me go back to something that I enjoyed about 30 or 40% of the time and hated about more than that of the time. This is God. If you'll just find Jesus in the situation you're in now, on a small scale, as you're going through your day, sometimes you drive by a bunch of homeless people in a bunch of corners and God didn't say do anything. And sometimes God may say, park your car, get out and offer to take them to buy them a meal. That's where Jesus is. It's just asking him, what are you up to, God? What are you doing? How can I join you in what you are doing? And it's tuning into him. So we look at this situation. Peter learned a huge, huge lesson, and God saved him. As soon as he got his eyes back on Jesus, that hand was right there to pull him up and keep him from going under. And keep in mind, it's just a story in the Bible, and we're thinking, oh, that's nice. We're in a nice, bright, beautiful sanctuary. They were still in a very, very windy sea in pitch blackness. I mean, there's just no light out there. They couldn't see well. And if he had sunk with the way the winds were blowing, he might not have been able to get to Jesus. He might not have been able to get back in the boat. It could have been really bad. And then we see the next thing. When they got Jesus in their boat, this is what happened. And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. See, that's what Jesus is always doing. He's trying to get us to see who he is. And once we see who he is, the automatic response is worship. I tried to worship God for the first 40 years of my life and failed miserably. Of course, my concept of worship was that 11 o'clock service in the Big Baptist Church that as a child that I grew up with when I was 5 years old, I could color on the bulletin, I could draw, mom would have a snack for me. But when dad, who was taking up the offering, and a deacon came and sat down, all that stuff had to vanish. He didn't want to see it because we're supposed to sit there and listen to the sermon. For a 5-year-old, it was a beat down. I didn't want to die. I thought, oh my gosh, if this is what heaven is, this is worship, that 11, 12 service, and you got to do it 24/7 for the rest of eternity. Oh God, I don't want to die. How's hell looking? That might be a better option. They were very similar to a 5-year-old. And worship didn't happen until I started having experiences with God. And that's really the important thing, is that you experience God. You can study him, you can read about him, you can learn about him. And just to give you a little bit of insight about how you experience God, on the intellectual path, that's where you'll learn about God. It's on the emotional path that you will experience him. What's Jesus doing? He's the creator of human beings. He understands how they change. In psychology, what I do is incredibly simple. It's my belief that the only time people ever make lasting, significant change is when they make a new decision in a state of deep or heightened emotion. Say that again for you. This is huge. This is everything I know about psychology with 34 years of formal education in one sentence. The only time people ever make lasting, significant change is when they make a new decision in a state of deep or heightened emotion. Jesus orchestrated that. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he was about to really convince these disciples. They had just had a heightened state of emotion when they watched him take the 2 fishes and 5 loaves and multiply it for 20,000 people. That's pretty cool. That's heightened emotion. They're making decisions. This guy's awesome. This guy can do absolutely anything. They didn't know what Jesus was going to do. They had no clue he's going to walk on the water. They'd never done that. Back in Matthew 8, they'd seen him. They'd been in the boat with him. When the storm came up on that sea, he was sound asleep in the back of the boat. And they finally woke him up and said, "Don't you care that we're about to die?" And then, he woke up. He spoke to the sea. He said, "Peace, be still." That's kind of emotional too. They felt like they were about to die. And then they realized he even commands the wind and the sea. They obey him. And then this situation, they see him walking on the water. Then they see one of their peers get out and do the same. And, Peter was always messing up. So they're probably thinking, "Oh, this guy's going to sink." He didn't. The least likely guy to succeed back in those days did it. I don't know how far. I wish I knew how far it was. We know they were in talking distance because they were terrified. They heard Jesus say over the wind, "Take heart, it is I. Don't be afraid." They heard that. And then Peter spoke to him and said, "If it's really you, Lord, tell me to come to you." So I don't know how far it was, maybe halfway, maybe back to the end of this church, maybe just 3 or 4 feet. But they literally saw Jesus standing on the water and Peter get out of the boat and walk on the water nearly to him. And then the wind, and then he sunk. So God is going to use your best times and your worst times. It's in those worst times that we pray more. Have you ever noticed how your prayer life increases dramatically when you're in deep weeds? It happens. So he's using the good times and the bad. If you can remember his ways, even when the bad times come, you can know, you can remember in the toughest times, he's still watching. He's still with you. Even if he sent you into the windy sea, and he's on the mountain, he's still praying for you. And at the perfect time, he's going to walk on the water if he has to get to you. And he's going to give you a chance to do what he does. And if you do it, great. And if you don't, he's right there to extend a hand to get you out of the depths. When you walk with Jesus, you're going to have some peaks and some valleys. You're going to have some good times and some bad times. But I want to keep you out of that cycle of forgetting how good he is, that he's always at work on your behalf. He's always moving you toward your highest good. I want you to stop forgetting and stop getting in fear and stop failing and stop falling. The way to do that is understand his goodness and that he's always at work, no matter where you are, no matter how much trouble you're in, no matter how much you're hurting. He's got a plan and it is in motion and he's overseeing it. And the faster you cooperate with him, the faster your pain and your discomfort is going to go away. So recognize him, understand him, and then find God in every situation. There will be situations you don't understand, but God is in every situation. It took them a little while to recognize Jesus, recognize what God is doing in any situation you're ever in. And finally, once you see him, once you found him, don't take your eyes off of him. Have you paid attention to how many times scripture says to keep your eyes on him? Hebrews says, fixing your eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of your faith. And he's constantly saying, lift up your eyes, look at me. Lift up your heads, look at me. Lift up your countenance, look at me. He's constantly saying, look at me, look at me, look at me. What does the evil one do? He says, well, that's fine to look at him, but look at this first. Look at this. Look at this. Look at the economy. Look at the pandemic they're trying to stir up again so they can shut us all down again. Look at this. Look at that. Look at all the stuff that's going on. Look at how bad our country is. Look at all these different things. And God's saying, hey, 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 look at me. Look at me. Just keep looking at me. I will handle everything. Don't look at that stuff. That stuff makes you unhappy. Would you like to know how to make yourself unhappy? I'm sure that's why you came today. You want to learn how to be more unhappy. Just keep looking at stuff you don't like. It works every time. You want to be happier, you want to be better, keep your eyes on Jesus, and you will just it becomes your default mode that no matter what happens, you thank him. We've talked about this before, the prepositions around gratitude. Give thanks in all things. Give thanks with all things. Give thanks for all things. So you enter his gates with thanksgiving. And then that thanksgiving moves to praise about how many wonderful things he's already done for you. And then it's going to lead you into worship where you're just absolutely awed by him. Do you realize how awed they were with Jesus? They've seen him feed the multitudes, multiply the food. They've seen him walk on the water. They've seen him teach Peter how to walk on the water. He did all right for a first lesson. He really did. And then they've seen him get in the boat and whew, the wind just stops. Second time, they've seen him control the wind. It resulted in worship. They were absolutely awed with him. I'll wrap it up with this today. Duncan and Kate Smith were people that had been involved in the Toronto Blessing. Well, they wanted to start a ministry to take that blessing to people groups that had never heard about Jesus. So John and Carol Arnott, who were the founders of the Toronto Blessing, and John and Carol were real interesting people. They had a church with about 400 members, probably about 200 in attendance, and God showed up there. And over the course of the years since back in the 90s, I think over 4 million people have been to that little church to experience what God was doing there. I've had many friends that have gone. Well, these people were ordained and blessed by John and Carol Arnott to start Catch the Fire World. That's their ministry. And they've got about 150 churches all over the world that they help, that they've led these people to Christ. They'd never heard of Jesus before, and they've got these growing churches. There was one particular chief of a tribe in West Africa, and he was just on Duncan's heart because they had heard from Heidi Baker's husband that there was a huge drought going on, and it'd been going on for a while, and it was getting to a really bad place because people were running out of food. And it was just on his heart that he wanted to do something specifically for this tribal leader and his group of about 70 nomadic people. They'd all come to Christ because of him. So he'd been at a leadership summit. He took up an offering, collected about $50,000 for these people. He left the leadership summit on Friday. He got home. The money was in the bank. He's from the UK. On Sunday, he flew to get to the place where he could possibly find this nomadic tribe. Now, they don't have cell phones. They don't have a permanent home. So he's really dependent on the Holy Spirit to find these people, to give them the money that he's trying to help them with. So he gets there on Sunday, he's thinking, man, as soon as the bank opens in the morning, he's like, oh my gosh, the bank here is going to be open, but my bank in the UK does not open until Tuesday because Monday's a bank holiday. And he was really miffed and upset about that. So he's got to wait another day. But on Tuesday morning, he's going to be at the bank in Africa. First thing, get his money and go find these people. There was a place called Ajani. And he thought probably that's where this tribal leader would go for food because it was just the closest place where there might be food. So he was going to plan to hope he could find him there. Total venture of faith. He's just moving as the Spirit leads him. He gets to the bank Tuesday morning. It's a little bank in West Africa. It takes him a while to round up $50,000. He doesn't get his money till about 2 o'clock. He's about ready to leave at 2:30. He knows the market in Ajani is going to close at 4, and it's a 4.5 to a 5 hour, 5.5 hour drive in a 4-wheel drive vehicle in low gear. It's a tough journey. And so he's got about 9 or 10 apostles with him. These are people that he's worked with over there that are leading other people groups, and they're going with him. He wants to get there, but he's got to be there. The market closes at 4. He's off to a real slow start. They're in the car. They're driving down a paved road. They've just left. It's 2:30. The market closes at 4. He slams his fist on the dashboard and yells, "In the name of Jesus, we're going to be there by 4 o'clock." And people are kind of like, they're thinking, no way, it's not going to happen. It's a 4.5 to 5.5 hour drive. And he's just bound and determined he's got to do it. They leave the paved road a little bit before 4. And as they're now driving in the deep sand, they're going through the thorn bushes. They're on the way. And at exactly 4 o'clock, one of the guys in the Land Rover starts yelling, "God, Johnny, God, Johnny." That means there's the city of Ajani. There is the city of Ajani. There it is. It's right there in front of us. He saw it, and they're coming to this city. This is wild stuff. I've had 2 friends that have been transported. I remember one time Mary Lane Klein and Marshall were going somewhere. It was a 4-hour drive. They made it in an hour and a half. John Paul Jackson one time left Dallas and got to a city in he got to Texarkana in like 20 minutes. His secretary said, "Where are you?" He said, "I'm in Texarkana." She said, "No, you're not. Where are you?" He said, "Well, just a minute." He got out. It was back in the days of payphones, before cell phones. And he was at a Dairy Queen with the payphone out in the parking lot. And he looked, there was a street sign across there. It said Texarkana. Said, "John Paul, you can't be there yet. You just left here 20 minutes ago." He was. These things can happen when you're traveling in the spirit realm. So he gets there, they get out. These people with him said, "Well, how in the world are we going to find this tribal leader in this village, in this market? Even if some of the market's still open, I mean, it's right at 4 o'clock, but how are we going to find him? What are we going to do?" He said, "Don't worry. God would not have performed this kind of miracle of moving a Land Rover full of about 10 people on a 4.5 to 5.5 hour trip in an hour and a half. He wouldn't have done this unless he's going to finish this deal." They walked into the market. They decided to turn on one street. As soon as they made their first turn, walking up is this tribal chief. And he sees them and he just starts sobbing. He just comes undone. When he's finally collected himself and he says, "Oh, Duncan, last night at 2 o'clock in the morning, I was on my camel coming to this market. And I was praying, God, we need Duncan. Duncan will be able to help us. We're out of food. We need him desperately. Please, somehow, send him to us." And here you are. That's not the end of the story. They spent $50,000 of that money for food for them. They bought bag after bag after bag of millet for these nomadic 70 people. 2 years later, when the drought ended, they still had some of that millet left. It's kind of like a superfood grain. It's really, really healthy. And they had enough. It's like the oil and the flour that never ran out. They had all they needed. And they had some left over to plant the next year's crop now that the drought was over. Keep yourself out of forgetfulness of how good God is, of fear that comes when you forget God, of failing and of falling, by just realizing he is at work for you 24/7. Find him in every situation. And when you find him, don't take your eyes off of him, and life will be really, really good for you.